It was a quiet Sunday morning, and I was enjoying my coffee while reviewing proposals for my startup when my phone lit up with a banking alert. Joint account balance, $283. Just moments before, there had been over $160,000 in there. Then came her message. "I'm leaving with Richard. Don't try to find us. We're flying somewhere you'll never look. Thanks for being so predictable with our finances. At least your boring attention to detail made this easy." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My first reaction wasn't anger or panic. I actually smiled, because Sarah had no idea about the letter I'd received from my grandfather's lawyer just 2 days before. The irony wasn't lost on me. My wife of 8 years had just emptied our joint account to run away with Richard Maxwell, her boss at the investment firm, where she'd worked for the past 3 years. The same Richard Maxwell who had given a speech at our wedding about loyalty and trust. The same man who had mentored me when I first started my tech company. And here they were, thinking they'd pulled off the perfect escape, probably feeling invincible as they headed to whatever exotic destination they'd picked for their new life together. I took another sip of my coffee, still hot, and opened my secure email. There it was, the confirmation from my grandfather's estate lawyer that I'd received the inheritance in 3 days. $5 million, tax-free. Money that Sarah knew nothing about, because my grandfather had made me promise not to tell anyone until the estate was settled. "Money changes people, David," he told me during our last conversation before he passed away. "Wait until everything's final. Trust me on this." And now, as I sat there in my home office, watching the morning sun cast shadows through the windows, I couldn't help but appreciate my grandfather's wisdom. Sarah thought she'd cleaned me out, thought she'd left me scrambling and desperate. She had no idea that her perfect timing had just handed me the sweetest opportunity for justice. I picked up my phone and typed out a simple response. "Enjoy the flight." 3 words that I knew would unsettle her more than any angry tirade. Sarah had always hated when she couldn't get a rise out of me. It drove her crazy when she couldn't predict my reactions, couldn't manipulate my emotions to her advantage. The truth was, I'd seen this coming for months. The signs had been there, clear as day if you knew where to look, and I had been looking carefully and quietly ever since that Christmas party at her firm 6 months ago. The way Richard's hand had lingered too long on her shoulder, the subtle glances they exchanged when they thought no one was watching, the sudden client meetings that always seemed to run late. I leaned back in my chair, thinking about all the precautions I'd already taken. The separate account I'd opened 3 months ago, where I'd been gradually moving my company's profits. The detailed records I'd kept of every suspicious transaction, every unexplained expense, every questionable business dinner. The security. Cameras I'd had installed in my home office, capturing Sarah going through my files late at night when she thought I was asleep. Most importantly, there was the USB drive locked in my lawyer's safe, containing everything I'd discovered about Richard Maxwell's creative accounting at his investment firm. Information that Sarah probably had no idea existed, but would prove very interesting to the SEC. I hadn't planned to use it until now. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Michael, my best friend since college and the head of security at Logan International Airport. "Hey Dave, you were right. They just checked in for a flight to Bali, first class. Want me to have a friendly chat with customs?" I smiled again, thinking about Sarah's face when she realized her grand escape wasn't going to be as smooth as she'd planned. "Not yet," I replied. "Let's give them time to get comfortable." The funny thing about people like Sarah and Richard is that they're so focused on the thrill of their betrayal, so caught up in their own cleverness that they forget to look at the bigger picture. They think in terms of days and weeks, not months and years. They plan the escape, but not the aftermath. They see the money they can grab, but not the consequences that follow. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to my lawyer, Rebecca Goldman. She'd been on standby for this, though even she didn't know about the inheritance yet. "It's time," I wrote. "Sarah made her move. Let's proceed with everything we discussed." Rebecca's response came within minutes. "On it. Meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Also, David, you seem oddly calm about this." I could almost hear the concern in her voice. Rebecca had seen plenty of clients go through divorces, but usually they were emotional wrecks by this point. They'd be crying, screaming, demanding immediate action, but that wasn't my style, never had been. "I'm calm because I've been preparing for this," I replied, "and because Sarah just made the biggest mistake of her life." Looking at the family photo on my desk, taken just last year during our vacation in Greece, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Not sadness, not really, not anger either. More like anticipation. Sarah thought she was writing the end of our story with her little escapade. She had no idea she'd just opened the door to a whole new chapter. My phone buzzed one more time. A final message from Sarah. "Why aren't you begging me to come back? Don't you even care?" I left it unanswered. She'd learned soon enough that silence can be more powerful than words. And as for caring, well, let's just say I cared enough to make sure this story would end very differently than she imagined. I closed my laptop and stood up, walking to the window. The morning had started with betrayal, but somehow I felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of watching, waiting, and preparing was finally lifted. Now, it was time for action. With my grandfather's inheritance coming in just 3 days, Sarah's hasty exit couldn't have been better timed. She thought she'd left me with nothing. Instead, she'd handed me everything I needed to not just survive, but thrive, and to make sure justice was served in the most unexpected way. I pulled out my phone one last time, making a call I'd been waiting to make for months. "Hello, James. It's David. Remember that tech acquisition we discussed? The one that would compete directly with Maxwell Investments? Let's move forward. I suddenly find myself with some unexpected capital to invest." The pieces were in place, the game was in motion. And Sarah? Sarah had no idea what was coming. Looking back, the signs had been there all along, like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. I remember exactly when I first noticed something was off. It was during the annual Christmas party at Maxwell. Investment 6 months ago. Sarah had insisted I attend, despite knowing I had a major client presentation the next morning. "You never make time for my work events," she'd complained, using that guilt-inducing tone she'd perfected over the years. The party was held at the prestigious Hamilton Hotel, the kind of place where they don't list prices on the menu and the waiters judge you by your watch brand. I arrived late, having finally wrapped up my presentation prep, only to find Sarah deep in conversation with Richard Maxwell in a quiet corner of the ballroom. There was nothing overtly inappropriate about it, just 2 colleagues talking at a work function. But something about their body language set off alarm bells in my head. Richard's hand rested casually on the back of Sarah's chair, his fingers just barely brushing her exposed shoulder. Sarah was leaning in slightly, laughing at something he'd said with that particular laugh she used to reserve for me. When she noticed me approaching, there was a split-second flash of annoyance in her eyes before she masked it with a smile. "David, finally!" she'd exclaimed, standing up too quickly. Richard was just telling me about the new Asian market expansion. The way she said his name had changed too. Softer, more familiar. Richard stood as well, greeting me with that confident smile that had made him such a successful investment manager. "David, my friend, how's that tech startup of yours coming along?" He'd asked it with just the right mix of interest and condescension. I remembered how he'd mentored me when I first started my company, how he'd introduced me to potential investors. Now looking back, I wondered if he'd been playing the long game even then. That night, I started paying attention to the details I'd been too busy to notice before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The way Sarah's phone would always be face down on tables, the sudden password, changes on her laptop, the new clothes that seemed specifically chosen to catch someone's attention, the late-night emergency client meetings that left her makeup slightly smudged and her hair not quite as perfect as when she'd left. I began documenting everything, not out of paranoia, but out of a deep-seated instinct that I'd need this information someday. I installed a sophisticated security system in our home, complete with cameras in the common areas. It wasn't just about catching them, it was about protecting myself. The footage from my home office camera proved particularly interesting. 3 times in 1 month, I caught Sarah going through my business files late at night. She was clearly looking for something specific, probably at Richard's request. Financial documents, client lists. Whatever it was, she didn't find it. I'd already moved anything sensitive to a secure location. Then came the mysterious expenses. Sarah had always been somewhat extravagant with money, but this was different. Luxury hotel charges on days she was supposedly at client meetings in our own city. Expensive restaurant bills for 2 at times when she claimed to be working late. A sudden interest in visiting high-end jewelry stores, but with nothing to show for it. I hired a private investigator, Tom Reeves, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate espionage. Document everything, he advised. Every unexplained absence, every suspicious charge, every inconsistency in her stories. But don't let on that you're watching. The moment they think you're onto them is the moment they'll accelerate their plans. Tom's reports were thorough and damning. Photos of Sarah and Richard having intimate dinners at out-of-the-way restaurants. Security footage of them entering and leaving hotels together. But most importantly, evidence that Richard was using their affair as cover for something bigger, unauthorized trades, manipulated accounts, client funds being moved in ways that would definitely interest federal regulators. I took this information to Rebecca Goldman, my lawyer, but not to use it immediately. This is insurance, I told her. Keep it safe. There may come a time when we need it. Rebecca had seen enough cases like this to understand. She added the evidence to a secure file she was building, along with records of all our assets, documentation of Sarah's spending patterns, and proof of my company's independent success. Your calmness about all this is almost unsettling, Rebecca had commented during one of our meetings. Most clients in your situation would be falling apart. I'd smiled at that. The best revenge isn't served in anger, I'd replied. It's served with careful planning and perfect timing. What Sarah never understood was that my boring attention to detail, as she'd called it in her goodbye text, wasn't a weakness, it was my strength. While she and Richard were caught up in their passion and schemes, I was quietly fortifying my position. I'd opened new accounts at different banks, gradually moving portions of my money to protect it. I'd secured my company's intellectual property and client relationships. I'd even started positioning my business for the very expansion that would eventually compete directly with Maxwell Investments. The final confirmation came just 2 weeks ago. I was working late at my office when I received an alert from one of the tracking programs I'd installed. Sarah was accessing our joint account, online, checking the balance. She'd been doing this more frequently lately, clearly planning her exit. The next day, she booked 2 first-class tickets to Bali, but not from our joint account. Those were purchased with a credit card I didn't recognize, probably provided by Richard. I could have confronted her then. I could have thrown the evidence in her face, demanded explanations, played the role of the betrayed husband, but that would have ruined everything I'd spent months preparing for. So I waited, knowing that people like Sarah and Richard couldn't resist the dramatic gesture. They wouldn't just leave. They'd want to make a statement. They'd want to hurt me, to prove their cleverness, to feel superior. All the while, I'd kept my grandfather's inheritance completely secret. Not even Rebecca knew about it yet. The timing was perfect, almost poetic, really. Sarah and Richard thought they were delivering a crushing blow by emptying the joint account. Instead, they were about to learn a harsh lesson about karma. The day before Sarah's dramatic exit, I'd met with James Chen, CEO of Rivaltech, one of the fastest-growing financial technology companies in the sector. We discussed a potential merger that would directly challenge Maxwell Investments' dominance in certain markets. The only thing holding us back had been funding. Funding that would no longer be an issue once my inheritance came through. "Your timing is impeccable," James had said when I called him after Sarah's departure. "Richard Maxwell's been trying to block our expansion for months. He seems particularly worried about our new trading platform." "Well," I'd replied, "let's give him something real to worry about." The pieces were all in place. Sarah and Richard thought they'd written the end of the story, but they'd only finished the first chapter. The next part, that would be written my way, with the kind of attention to detail they'd never see coming. The meeting with Rebecca Goldman the next morning set everything in motion. I arrived at her downtown office early, armed with a thick folder of documents and a fresh sense of purpose. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a perfect view of the financial district, including the gleaming tower where Maxwell Investments occupied the top 5 floors, where Sarah and Richard had plotted their great escape, thinking they were so clever. "So," Rebecca began, arranging her papers with practiced precision, "shall we discuss how we're going to handle this?" She paused, studying my face for any signs of emotional distress. Finding none, she continued, "The good news is we're incredibly well prepared. The bad news is they've given us more ammunition than we could have hoped for." I smiled, sliding an envelope across her desk. "There's one more piece of information you should see." Inside was the letter from my grandfather's estate lawyer, confirming the $5 million inheritance. Rebecca's eyes widened as she read it, a rare break in her professional composure. "This changes everything," she said, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "They have no idea about this, do they?" "Not a clue," I confirmed. "Sarah thinks she's left me financially crippled. She and Richard probably imagine me panicking, scrambling to keep my company afloat." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the USB drive in my pocket, the one containing all the evidence of Richard's questionable trading practices. "But before we deal with the divorce, there's something else we need to discuss." For the next hour, we went through the evidence I'd gathered about Richard's activities at Maxwell Investments. The unauthorized trades, the manipulated client accounts, the pattern of financial misconduct that went far beyond his affair with my wife. Rebecca's expression grew increasingly serious as she reviewed the documents. "This is federal-level stuff, David," she said finally. "SEC violations, possible fraud. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" I nodded. "Richard didn't just steal my wife, he betrayed my trust as a mentor, used our friendship to gather intelligence on my company, and now he thinks he can just walk away with everything. It's time he learned about consequences." Rebecca made a phone call to a contact she knew at the SEC's enforcement division. Within hours, we had a meeting scheduled for the following day, but that was just the beginning. My phone buzzed. A message from Michael at the airport. "Their flight just landed in Bali. Want me to send that customs info now?" "Perfect timing," I replied. "Go ahead." I'd discovered months ago that Richard had failed to declare significant overseas investments on his customs forms during his frequent business trips. A clear violation, and one that my friend Michael was happy to bring to the attention of customs officials. By the time Sarah and Richard tried to return to the States, they'd find themselves facing some very uncomfortable questions, but the real movement was happening back home. James from Rival Tech had already set up a meeting with his board to discuss our merger. With my inheritance providing the necessary capital, we could accelerate our plans to compete directly with Maxwell Investments. Richard had always been dismissive of my little tech startup, as he called it. He was about to learn just how short-sighted that attitude had been. Around noon, I received the first panicked message from Sarah. Apparently their attempt to check into the luxury resort in Bali had hit a snag. The credit cards were declining, all of them. Richard's corporate cards, their personal cards, even the new ones they'd gotten specifically for this trip. It seems the fraud alert I'd called in, combined with some strategic calls to their banks from Rebecca, had created quite the financial roadblock. "What did you do?" Sarah's text read. "Why aren't the cards working?" I left it unanswered, imagining them standing in the opulent hotel lobby, their perfect getaway crumbling around them. They'd eventually find somewhere to stay, of course. Richard probably had emergency funds available, but the first crack in their fantasy had appeared. Later that afternoon, I met with my company's board to discuss our expansion plans. The inheritance money would allow us to accelerate our development timeline significantly. By the time Richard realized what was happening, we'd be positioning ourselves as a major threat to his firm's market share. "Your wife's affair might turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to this company," commented Marcus, one of my senior developers, after the board meeting. He didn't know about the inheritance yet. Few people did. But he could see how focused and determined I'd become. That evening I received an interesting call from Tom Reeves, the private investigator. He'd been monitoring Richard's office communications through some of his contacts. "Panic mode over there," Tom reported. "Richard just tried to access certain trading accounts remotely and found himself locked out. Seems someone tipped off compliance about some irregularities. They've frozen several major accounts pending investigation." I could picture Richard sitting in his luxury Bali hotel room once they'd finally found one that would accept their remaining functional credit card, discovering that his carefully constructed house of cards was beginning to wobble. The man had always been arrogant, always believed he was the smartest person in any room. That arrogance was about to cost him everything. Sarah sent several more messages throughout the day, each more desperate than the last. The final one read, "You're being childish, David. Blocking our cards. Really? I thought you were better than this. I almost laughed at that." She still thought this was just about frozen credit cards and spite. She had no idea about the SEC investigation that was about to launch, or the business moves that would threaten everything she and Richard had planned for their future. Rebecca called late in the evening with updates. The SEC was very interested in our evidence. They'd be opening a formal investigation into Maxwell Investments first thing in the morning. Additionally, she'd filed our divorce papers, making sure they included detailed documentation of Sarah's financial misconduct. "We're moving fast," Rebecca noted, "but everything is by the book. They won't be able to claim we're acting in bad faith. You've documented everything too well for that." I ended the day back in my home office, looking at that family photo from Greece. Sarah's smile seemed different now, calculating perhaps, or maybe it always had been and I just hadn't wanted to see it. I took the photo down and placed it in a drawer. It was time for new memories, new successes. My phone buzzed one final time, a message from James at Rival Tech. "Board approved the merger discussion. We can meet tomorrow to start planning the takeover. Richard Maxwell won't know what hit him." I smiled, thinking about the dominoes that were now falling. Sarah and Richard had planned their escape, thinking they held all the cards. They had no idea they'd walked right into a trap of their own making. Tomorrow, the real consequences would begin to unfold, and their perfect little getaway would start to feel a lot more like a prison. "Looking forward to it," I replied to James. Then I turned off my phone, poured myself a celebratory scotch, and began planning the next phase of my response. Because while Sarah and Richard thought they'd written the end of this story, I was just getting started with my version of events. The next few days unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance. While Sarah and Richard were still trying to salvage their romantic getaway in Bali, the real action was happening back home. The morning started with a call from Linda Maxwell, Richard's wife. Yes, the man who'd run away with my wife had conveniently forgotten to mention he was still married himself. "Is it true?" Linda's voice was steady, controlled, but I could hear the anger simmering beneath the surface. "My lawyer just showed me the SEC investigation notice. Richard's running around with your wife while our entire life savings might be at risk." I hadn't known about Linda's call coming today, but I'd expected something like it. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," I replied, genuine sympathy in my voice. Linda had always been kind to me at company events. "But yes, it's all true. I have documentation if you need it for your own lawyer." Her laugh was bitter. "Oh, I'll need it. And David, make him pay." The SEC investigation was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. By mid-morning, news had already started circulating through the financial district. Maxwell Investments stock took an immediate hit when word got out that federal regulators were looking into their trading practices. Richard's carefully cultivated reputation for financial genius was about to crumble. My phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from Sarah, each one more frantic than the last. "The resort is asking us to leave. Something about our credit card being reported stolen. What are you doing, David?" I smiled, remembering how Sarah used to mock my attention to detail, my insistence on keeping records of everything. "You're being paranoid," she'd say, whenever I questioned one of her expensive purchases or late-night client meetings. Now that same attention to detail was systematically dismantling her perfect escape plan. Around noon, I met with James and the Rival Tech board to finalize our merger plans. With my inheritance money now officially in my accounts, we could move, aggressive, with our expansion. The timing couldn't have been better. Maxwell Investments clients were already getting nervous about the SEC investigation, and we were positioning ourselves as a stable, tech-forward alternative. "Their Asian market expansion?" James said during the meeting, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "The one Richard was so smug about at that Christmas party? We're going to take it from them, every last bit of it." Back at my office, Rebecca called with updates from multiple fronts. The divorce proceedings were moving forward smoothly, with the judge taking special interest in the evidence of Sarah's financial misconduct. The joint account she'd emptied? The court had already frozen. What remained of it in an overseas account they'd tried to transfer it to. "But here's the best part," Rebecca said, barely containing her professional glee. "Remember those late-night visits Sarah made to your home office? The ones you caught on camera? Turns out she was photographing confidential documents about your company's trading algorithms. We've just filed corporate espionage charges." That explained why Richard had seemed so prepared for my company's every move in recent months. He'd been using Sarah to gather intelligence, probably promising her a share in the profits when Maxwell Investments crushed my little startup. Tom Reeves, my PI, had more interesting news. His sources inside Maxwell Investments reported chaos. Richard's absence combined with the SEC investigation had created a leadership vacuum. Several major clients had already started pulling their accounts. The board was calling for an emergency meeting. They tried video conferencing Richard in from Bali, Tom reported. But apparently the hotel's Wi-Fi wasn't working. Something about their room being relocated to a different wing, a much less luxurious wing. I had to admire the irony. Sarah and Richard had planned their escape down to the last detail. The flights, the hotels, the cleaned-out bank account. But they'd forgotten the most basic rule of running away. Make sure you've got somewhere to run to. By late afternoon, the situation had deteriorated further. Richard's corporate email had been suspended pending the investigation. His access to company systems was revoked. The board of Maxwell Investments, trying to distance themselves from the scandal, had placed him on indefinite leave. Sarah's messages had taken on a different tone. "David, please, you've made your point. This is getting out of hand. Richard says his wife is threatening to take everything. Can't we talk about this?" I forwarded the message to Rebecca without responding. "Add it to the evidence file," I wrote. "Shows consciousness of guilt." That evening I had dinner with Michael, my airport security friend, who'd helped set things in motion. "You should have seen the customs report I filed," he chuckled. "Let's just say their return trip is going to involve a lot of interesting conversations with federal agents." "If they can even find a flight," I replied. "Shouldn't their return tickets be cancelling right about now?" Michael checked his phone, grinning. "Yep, fraud alert on the credit card they used to book them. They're officially stranded in paradise." The next morning brought more developments. Linda Maxwell's lawyer had contacted Rebecca about cooperating in both the divorce proceedings and the SEC investigation. Apparently, Linda had documentation of her own about Richard's financial misconduct. Evidence she'd been gathering for months, just like me. "Looks like you weren't the only one paying attention to details," Rebecca commented. The local business papers had picked up the story. "Maxwell Investments under federal investigation," read one headline. "Tech startup rival tech. Positions for major market expansion," read another. The timing wasn't coincidental. James had made sure our announcement went out just as news of the SEC investigation broke. Sarah's sister Catherine called around lunchtime. "David, she's been crying for hours. Says you've ruined everything. What's going on?" I explained the situation calmly, including Sarah's theft, her corporate espionage, and her affair with a married man. Catherine was silent for a long moment. "She always did think she was smarter than everyone else," Catherine finally said. "Guess she met her match." The day ended with one final piece of news. Tom's sources reported that Richard had received an email from his personal accountant. Apparently, in his haste to leave the country, he'd forgotten about some rather important tax payments coming due. Combined with the frozen accounts and suspended salary, his financial situation was becoming dire. "They're fighting," Tom reported. His sources in Bali say they can hear Sarah and Richard arguing through the hotel walls. Something about him promising her financial security and now not even being able to pay for room service. I sat in my home office that evening, looking at the space where the Greece photo had hung. In its place, I'd mounted the front page of the financial paper announcing our merger with rival tech. A better memory, a stronger future. My phone buzzed. One last time that night, a message from Richard himself. "David, let's talk about this. You're taking things too far. We can work something out." I smiled, remembering all the times Richard had lectured me about business strategy over the years. "Always know your leverage," he'd say. "Always be prepared for every contingency." Well, I'd learned that lesson well, perhaps too well for his liking. I typed out a response, then deleted it. Sometimes silence is the best reply. Let them stew in their paradise-turned-prison, watching as their carefully planned future crumbled around them. Tomorrow would bring new developments, new consequences, new realizations of just how completely they'd underestimated me. After all, they'd thought this was a simple story of betrayal and escape. They had no idea they were actually living in a cautionary tale about karma. And karma, as they were learning, had an excellent attention to detail. A week into their romantic getaway, Sarah and Richard's dream escape had transformed into a nightmare. I sat in my newly expanded office, now occupying half of the 30th floor in downtown's most prestigious building, reading the latest updates from various sources. The view was spectacular, but the incoming reports were even better. Tom Reeves had just sent me surveillance photos from Bali. Sarah and Richard had been downgraded from their luxury resort to a modest tourist hotel in a less desirable area. The images showed them arguing in the hotel lobby, Sarah gesturing wildly while Richard seemed to be pleading with the hotel manager. Their faces showed the strain of a paradise lost. According to my local contact, Tom's report read, they've been reduced to using Richard's emergency cash reserves. Most of their cards are still blocked, and the few that work have such low limits they can barely cover daily expenses. They've tried calling their banks, but somehow all their accounts are under review for suspicious activity. Rebecca Goldman, my lawyer, had orchestrated that particular symphony of financial inconvenience. It's amazing, she'd commented earlier. That morning, how many red flags can pop up when you have the right documentation of suspicious banking activity? But their financial troubles were just the beginning. The SEC investigation into Maxwell Investments had expanded dramatically. What started as a probe into Richard's suspicious trading activities had uncovered a pattern of irregularities that stretched back years. The company's stock had plummeted, and clients were jumping ship at an alarming rate. Linda Maxwell, Richard's wife, had proven to be an unexpected ally. Her own documentation of Richard's financial misconduct, combined with our evidence, had created an airtight case. She'd filed for divorce the day after learning about his affair with Sarah, and her lawyers were coordinating with both the SEC and our team. He always thought he was untouchable, Linda had said during our meeting with the SEC investigators. He didn't think anyone was paying attention to his late nights, his hidden accounts, his creative trading strategies. But I kept records of everything just like you did, David. I was just waiting for the right moment. The merger with Rivaltech was proceeding ahead of schedule. With my inheritance capital fueling our expansion, we'd already acquired 2 of Maxwell Investments' most lucrative clients. James had been masterful in positioning our company as the stable, innovative alternative to Richard's crumbling empire. Their entire Asian market strategy is falling apart, James reported during our morning meeting. Without Richard at the helm, and with the SEC breathing down their necks, they're losing contracts by the hour. We're picking them up at a fraction of the cost. My phone buzzed with another message from Sarah. David, please, this has gone too far. Richard's wife is taking everything. The SEC has frozen his accounts. We can barely afford to eat, let alone fly home. I made a mistake. Can't we talk about this? I showed the message to Rebecca, who added it to her ever-growing file of evidence. Interesting how quickly true colors show when the money runs out, she observed. Should I tell her about the corporate espionage charges yet? Not yet, I replied. Let's wait until they try to come home. That moment was approaching faster than they knew. My friend Michael from Airport Security had updated me on their increasingly desperate attempts to book return flights. With their credit cards blocked and their bank accounts frozen, they'd tried to arrange payment through Richard's corporate travel account, only to find it suspended pending the SEC investigation. They don't know it yet, Michael reported, but even if they find a way to book flights, they're both on a customs watch list. The second they try to enter the country, they'll be met by some very interested federal agents. Sarah's family had stopped trying to advocate for her. Her sister Catherine had called again, this time with a different tone. I found her diary, she said, the one she kept in her desk at home. She'd been planning this for months, David, writing about how she and Richard would take everything you had, how they'd use your company's trade secrets to crush you. I don't even recognize who my sister became. The diary would make an excellent addition to our evidence, I thought. Rebecca agreed when I called to tell her about it. Between that, the security footage of her stealing company documents, and the records of her financial misconduct, she'll be lucky if she avoids criminal charges, she said. Around mid-afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Maxwell Investments' board of directors. They wanted to meet immediately. An hour later, I sat in their opulent boardroom, the same room where Richard had once held court as their financial genius. "We're looking at a complete restructuring," the board chairman explained, looking tired and defeated. "Richard's actions have devastated this company. Our reputation is in tatters, our clients are fleeing, and the SEC investigation is only getting worse. We understand you're in a position to acquire certain assets." I listened to their proposal with carefully concealed satisfaction. They wanted to sell, not just clients or contracts, but entire divisions of the company. Richard's kingdom was being parceled out, and they were offering me first choice of the pieces. "I'll have my team review the numbers," I said, already knowing I'd accept. The irony was delicious. The company Richard had used to mentor me, then tried to destroy me, would now become part of my expanding empire. That evening, as I prepared to leave the office, Tom sent one final update from Bali. He'd intercepted an email exchange between Richard and his personal lawyer back home. The lawyer's message was blunt. Richard needed to return to face the SEC investigation or risk having arrest warrants issued. But returning meant facing not only the SEC, but also the corporate espionage charges, his wife's divorce lawyers, and the board's allegations of breach of fiduciary duty. "They're trapped," Tom wrote. "Can't afford to stay in Bali, can't safely return home. Sarah's been calling five-star hotels all over Asia, trying to find someone who'll accept their remaining valid credit card. No luck so far." I smiled, remembering Sarah's last text to me before she'd left. "Thanks for being so predictable with our finances." She'd thought my careful attention to detail was a weakness, something to be mocked. She never understood that. I'd been playing a much longer game. My phone buzzed again. A message from James. The latest financial news was reporting that Maxwell Investments stock had been suspended from trading pending the SEC investigation. Richard's net worth, much of it tied up in company stock, had effectively evaporated. "Ready to make an offer on their Asian division?" James asked. "They're practically giving it away now." I looked out my office window at the city lights below. Somewhere in a mediocre hotel in Bali, Sarah and Richard were watching their dreams crumble. Their grand escape turned into a trap of their own making. They'd thought they were writing a story of triumphant betrayal. Instead, they'd become cautionary tales about the danger of underestimating the quiet ones, the detail-oriented ones, the ones who keep careful records and play the long game. "Make the offer," I replied to James. "It's time to close this chapter." My grandfather's words echoed in my memory. "Money changes people, David. Wait until everything's final. Trust me on this." He'd been right, of course. By keeping the inheritance secret, I'd given Sarah and Richard enough rope to hang themselves. They'd shown their true colors, made their choices, and now they were facing the consequences. The Greece photo might be in a drawer, but I had a new picture to hang, the front page of tomorrow's financial paper announcing our acquisition of Maxwell Investments' key divisions, a better memory, a stronger future, and a reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't just about getting even. It's about rising so far above your betrayers that they become nothing more than a cautionary tale in your success story. 2 weeks after Sarah and Richard's dramatic escape, their fairy tale had turned into a cautionary tale. I sat in my expanded office, now preparing for a board meeting that would finalize our acquisition of Maxwell Investments' key divisions, when Rebecca called with the news I'd been waiting for. "They're trying to come home," she said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "They finally managed to book economy tickets through some budget airline. They land tomorrow morning. Should I tell our friends at customs to be ready?" I leaned back in my chair, looking at the wall where multiple framed newspaper headlines chronicled my company's meteoric rise over the past 2 weeks. "Make sure everyone's in position," I replied. "Let's give them the homecoming they deserve." The past 14 days had transformed the business landscape dramatically. Maxwell Investments, once the crown jewel of the financial district, had been gutted by the expanding SEC investigation. Their stock, suspended from trading, had effectively wiped out Richard's personal wealth. The board had been forced to sell off divisions at fire sale prices, many of them to my newly merged company. Tom Reeves had kept me updated on Sarah and Richard's declining situation in Bali. Their arguments had become legendary at the tourist hotel where they'd ended up staying. "The staff calls them the fighting foreigners," Tom reported. "They've been overheard arguing about everything, from their dwindling funds to who's really to blame for their situation." Linda Maxwell had proven to be a formidable ally. Her divorce proceedings against Richard were proceeding at record speed, aided by the mountain of evidence we'd both collected. She'd already secured a freeze on all their marital assets, leaving Richard with virtually nothing to his name. "You know what's funny?" Linda had said during our last meeting with the SEC investigators. "He always treated us both like we were somehow beneath him. Me, his devoted wife, and you, his mentee. He never realized we were both taking notes, keeping records, just waiting for him to show his true colors." The corporate espionage charges against Sarah had been filed the previous day. The evidence was damning. Security footage of her photographing confidential documents, her diary detailing their plans, forensic evidence from her laptop showing transferred company files. The prosecutors were confident about the case. "She's looking at serious charges," Rebecca had explained. "Corporate espionage, conspiracy, wire fraud. Richard's not much better off. The SEC investigation has uncovered evidence of securities fraud going back years." Their return flight was scheduled to land at 9:15 a.m. the next day. I'd arranged to have a front row seat for their homecoming, though they wouldn't know I was there. Michael had set everything up perfectly. "Customs will stop them for questioning about those undeclared overseas investments," he explained. "While they're detained, the FBI will serve Richard with his subpoena for the SEC investigation, and the local police will serve Sarah with her corporate espionage charges. It should be quite a show." The morning of their return, I arrived at the airport early, settling into the private lounge with a clear view of the customs area. Tom's sources confirmed their flight had taken off, in economy class, a far cry from their first-class escape just 2 weeks ago. "They spent the entire flight arguing," a flight attendant reported to Tom. She kept blaming him for not having a better backup plan. He kept reminding her that she was the one who insisted on emptying the account immediately instead of waiting. Their flight landed on schedule. Through the lounge's windows, I watched them emerge from customs. Sarah in wrinkled designer clothes that had seen better days, Richard looking nothing like the polished financier he'd once been. They were arguing even as they walked, too, absorbed in their blame game, to notice the officials approaching from multiple directions. "Mr. Maxwell, Mrs. Harrison," the customs officer's voice carried clearly through the terminal. "We need you to come with us. There are some questions about your financial declarations." I watched as the color drained from Richard's face. He knew exactly what declarations they were talking about. Sarah, still not grasping the magnitude of their situation, started to argue with the officials. That's when the FBI agents approached, badges out. "Mr. Maxwell, we have a subpoena for you regarding the SEC investigation into Maxwell Investments." They were followed immediately by local police, who focused on Sarah. "Mrs. Harrison, you're under arrest for corporate espionage and conspiracy." The scene that followed would have been comedic if it weren't so satisfying. Sarah and Richard, finally realizing the full extent of their situation, turned on each other immediately. Their voices echoed through the terminal. "You said you had everything under control," Sarah shouted at Richard. "You promised me we'd be set for life." "Me," Richard shot back. "You're the one who insisted on running off immediately. If we'd waited, planned properly." They were led away to separate interrogation rooms, their dreams of a new life together ending in handcuffs and mutual recrimination. I received updates throughout the day as events unfolded. Richard's questioning by the SEC lasted hours. They had evidence of everything. The unauthorized trades, the manipulated accounts, the offshore holdings he'd failed to declare. His attempts to blame others fell apart as the investigators presented document after document, many provided by Linda. And me? Sarah's interrogation was equally thorough. The corporate espionage charges were just the beginning. The investigators had her diary, her text messages, security footage, and financial records showing her systematic theft and conspiracy. Her attempts to play the victim fell flat against the mountain of evidence. By evening, the story had hit the financial news. Maxwell Investments executive and paramour arrested on multiple charges, read one headline. The article detailed everything. Their failed escape, the SEC investigation, the corporate espionage charges, and the impending divorces they both faced. Rebecca called with updates from the legal front. Richard's being held without bail, flight risk given recent events. Sarah's looking at significant jail time for the corporate espionage charges. Their lawyers are already approaching us about plea deals. I sat in my office that evening, looking at the latest acquisition papers. Maxwell Investments' Asian division was now officially part of our company. The merger with Rival Tech had created one of the most powerful financial technology firms in the market, all funded by the inheritance Sarah never knew about, triggered by the very action she thought would destroy me. My phone buzzed one last time, a message from Sarah, somehow sent from custody. "I'm sorry, David. I didn't know. I never understood what I had. Can we talk?" I left it unanswered, just as I had all her messages from Bali. Some betrayals can't be undone, some bridges can't be rebuilt. Sarah and Richard had written the beginning of this story with their arrogance and betrayal, but I had written the ending with patience, preparation, and perfect timing. The Greece photo remained in my desk drawer, a reminder of lessons learned. But my office walls now held different memories. News articles about our company's success, photos of our expanding team, awards for innovation and growth. These were better memories, stronger memories, untainted by betrayal. Linda Maxwell joined me for dinner that evening to celebrate the end of this chapter. "You know what Richard's lawyer told him today?" she said, savoring her wine. "That he's facing up to 20 years for the securities fraud alone, not counting all the other charges." "And Sarah?" I asked, though I already knew from Rebecca. 5 to 10 for corporate espionage minimum, plus civil penalties that will bankrupt her for life. Linda raised her glass. "To karma, and to those who help it along with careful documentation." I smiled, thinking about my grandfather's wisdom about money changing people. He was right, but not in the way Sarah and Richard had expected. My inheritance hadn't just given me the means to survive their betrayal. It had given me the power to turn their betrayal into my greatest triumph. The next morning I stood in my office, looking out at the city skyline. Somewhere in federal custody, Sarah and Richard were facing the consequences of their choices. Their dream of a new life, together, had lasted exactly 2 weeks, ending not in a Bali paradise, but in airport handcuffs and mutual recriminations. As for me, I had a company to run, expansion plans to implement, and a future that looked brighter than ever. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just about getting even. It's about rising so far above your betrayers that they become nothing more than a footnote in your success story. And Sarah's last text about me being predictable with finances. Well, I guess some people mistake careful planning for predictability. That's fine. Let them underestimate the quiet ones, the detailed ones, the ones who play the long game. In the end, we're the ones who write the final chapter. 6 months after Sarah and Richard's dramatic airport arrest, I stood at the podium. of the National Business Innovation Awards, accepting the Entrepreneur of the Year award. The irony wasn't lost on me, or anyone else who knew the full story. The very people who had tried to destroy my company had instead catalyzed its transformation into an industry leader. Success, I told the assembled crowd of business leaders, often comes from unexpected places. Sometimes what looks like your darkest moment becomes the foundation of your greatest triumph. The audience applauded, unaware that I was speaking about more than just business strategy. Earlier that day, I'd received the final update from Rebecca about Sarah and Richard's legal proceedings. Richard had finally accepted a plea deal, 15 years for securities fraud, with additional charges running concurrently. The man who once commanded a corner office in the city's most prestigious building now occupied a cell in a federal prison. He broke down during the final hearing, Rebecca reported. Started talking about how he'd had everything: successful company, loving wife, respected position in the community, and lost it all for what he called a midlife crisis gone horribly wrong. Sarah's situation wasn't much better. She'd been sentenced to 7 years for corporate espionage, plus massive financial penalties. Her attempts to play the victim had backfired spectacularly when prosecutors presented her diary entries detailing their plans to steal my company's trade secrets. The judge was particularly harsh, Rebecca noted. Said she'd never seen someone so callously betray both personal and professional trust at the same time. Sarah's appeals have all been denied. The merger with rival tech had exceeded everyone's expectations. Our combined company, now renamed Innovatech Solutions, had effectively absorbed most of Maxwell Investments' former market share. The inheritance, money that Sarah had known nothing about, had funded an expansion that transformed the entire industry landscape. Linda Maxwell, now officially divorced from Richard, had become a close friend and valuable business ally. She'd used her settlement money to start a consulting firm specializing in corporate fraud prevention, with our company as her first client. "You know what Richard's cellmate told my lawyer?" Linda mentioned during our weekly lunch. "Apparently, Richard spends most of his time talking about how he had it all figured out, how his plan was perfect. He still can't accept that he was outsmarted by the people he underestimated." Tom Reeves, whose investigative work had been crucial to our success, now headed our corporate security division. His team had transformed our company's security protocols, making us an industry leader in protecting intellectual property. The Sarah and Richard case study is now part of our training program, Tom told me during our morning briefing. We use it to show how corporate espionage often combines personal and professional betrayal. The security footage of Sarah stealing company documents is particularly effective. The corporate world had taken notice of our story, though few knew all the details. Business magazines wrote about the miraculous timing of our expansion, how we'd seized opportunity from the collapse of Maxwell Investments. Some called it luck, others called it strategic genius. Only a small circle knew the full truth, how careful preparation and perfect timing had turned an act of betrayal into a triumph of justice. My friend Michael from Airport Security had been promoted to head of international operations, partly due to his role in uncovering Richard's customs violations. "You should see the training presentations we give now," he laughed during our monthly dinner. "Your case is literally in the manual under How to Spot Financial Fraud at Border Control." Sarah's family had completely cut ties with her. Her sister Catherine had become an unexpected supporter, even investing in our company's latest expansion. "I found more of Sarah's diaries," Catherine confided during a recent board meeting. "Going back years, she'd always been planning something like this, always looking for a bigger score. She wrote about how she married you for your potential, thinking she could ride your success to something better. Instead, she ended up watching that success from behind bars." The Greece photo had long since been moved from my desk drawer to a sealed box in storage, along with other remnants of that chapter of my life. My office walls now displayed different memories: the Innovation Award, coverage of our international expansion, photos of our growing team. My grandfather's wisdom about money-changing people had proven prophetic in ways none of us could have imagined. The inheritance he'd insisted I keep secret had become the instrument not just of justice, but of transformation. While Sarah and Richard's betrayal had been meant to destroy me, it had instead forced me to evolve, to grow, to become something stronger than before. James, my partner in the rival tech merger, often joked about the poetic justice of it all. "They thought they were so clever," he said during our executive retreat, "running off to Bali with your joint account, thinking they'd left you ruined. Instead, they triggered a series of events that turned you into their worst nightmare. The person who took everything they had. The business world can be ruthless, but it respects results. Our company's stock had tripled since the merger. The same investors who'd once backed Richard now sought meetings with me. The Asian market expansion that Sarah and Richard had mocked, as overambitious, was now our most profitable division. Rebecca had framed the final court documents in her office. A reminder, she said, that justice may be slow, but it can be thorough when properly prepared. "You know what the prosecutor told me," she mentioned during our last meeting. "In all his years of corporate crime cases, he'd never seen someone so completely hoist by their own petard. They literally handed us everything we needed to destroy them." The long-term implications of their actions continued to ripple through the financial industry. The SEC had used Richard's case to implement stricter trading regulations. Our company's security protocols, developed in response to Sarah's corporate espionage, had become industry standard. Their betrayal had inadvertently made the entire system stronger. My phone rarely buzzed with messages from Sarah anymore. Her last communication, sent through her prison email system, had been almost philosophical. I never understood what real power was. I thought it was about grand gestures and bold moves. You showed me it's about patience, preparation, and paying attention to details. I learned too late. I never replied. Some lessons are best learned in silence. Standing in my office on the evening of the Innovation Awards, I looked out at the city lights below. Somewhere in a federal prison, Richard was probably staring at concrete walls, wondering how his perfect plan had gone so wrong. In another facility, Sarah was likely reflecting on how her dream of a glamorous new life had turned into a cautionary tale. And me. I had built something larger than any of us had imagined possible, the quiet one, the detailed one, the one they'd underestimated. I had turned their betrayal into the foundation of an empire. My grandfather would have appreciated the irony. The inheritance they hadn't known about had given me the power to transform their betrayal into my greatest victory. The next morning, I had breakfast with Linda, Catherine, and Rebecca, my unlikely coalition of allies brought together by betrayal and justice. We didn't talk about Sarah or Richard anymore. Instead, we discussed expansion plans, new projects, future possibilities. "You know what the best revenge really is?" Linda mused, stirring her coffee. "It's not just success. It's success so complete that your betrayers become irrelevant. They're not even worth mentioning anymore." She was right. Sarah and Richard had tried to write a story of triumphant betrayal. Instead, they'd become a footnote in a much larger narrative, one about resilience, strategic thinking, and the power of playing the long game. The Greece photo might be in storage, but I had new pictures to frame, ones that told a better story, a stronger story, a story about how sometimes the very people who try to destroy you end up giving you the opportunity to become something far greater than they could have imagined. 1 year to the day after Sarah's text message about emptying our joint account, I stood in my expanded office suite. now occupying the entire top floor of the city's most prestigious business tower, the same building where Richard Maxwell had once reigned as a financial king. The view was different from up here. You could see the whole city, including the federal courthouse, where their dreams had crumbled. The morning news played silently on the wall-mounted screen, showing coverage of Maxwell Investments' final dissolution. The company that Richard had built, that he'd used to mentor me and then tried to destroy me, was being formally dissolved. Its remaining assets had been acquired by our now dominant firm, Innovatech Solutions. "Poetic justice," James commented, joining me at the window. "Their betrayal literally handed us the tools to build an empire. Have you seen the latest valuation numbers?" I had. Our company's worth had quadrupled since the merger. The inheritance money that Sarah had known nothing about had funded an expansion that transformed not just our company, but the entire industry. We weren't just successful, we were revolutionaries, changing how the financial technology sector operated. Tom Reeves entered with his morning security briefing. "Interesting update from my sources in the federal system," he began. "Richard's trying to write a book about his fall from grace. The publishers aren't interested. They say his story's already been told by the business press, and not in the way he'd like." That made me smile. Richard had always seen himself as the hero of his own story. Even now, serving his 15-year sentence, he couldn't accept that he'd become nothing more than a cautionary tale in business ethics seminars. Rebecca Goldman arrived for our regular legal update, carrying a thick folder of documents. "The civil penalties against Sarah have been finalized," she reported. "Every penny she managed to hide, every asset she tried to protect, it's all gone. She'll be paying restitution for decades after she's released." The corporate espionage charges had hit Sarah harder than the betrayal charges. She'd lost not just her freedom, but her entire future in the financial industry. Her professional licenses had been revoked, her reputation destroyed. The woman who'd thought she could outsmart everyone had outsmarted only herself. Linda Maxwell, now a renowned consultant on corporate fraud prevention, had turned their story into a powerful teaching tool. "I use their case in every seminar," she told me during our weekly strategy meeting. "People are fascinated by how thoroughly they destroyed themselves. It's like watching a masterclass in self-sabotage." Catherine, Sarah's sister, had become an unexpected ally in our company's growth. "You know what's ironic?" she mused during our board meeting. "Sarah always talked about wanting to be part of something big, something revolutionary. She could have had that with you, if she'd just been patient and loyal. The inheritance from my grandfather had grown far beyond its original $5 million. Through careful investment and strategic expansion, we'd turned it into a corporate empire, worth billions. The money that Sarah hadn't known about had become the foundation of something far greater than she could have imagined. Michael, my airport security friend who'd helped orchestrate their homecoming, had been promoted to head of international operations for the entire airport system. "Your case study is required reading now," he reported. "We use it to train agents on spotting financial criminals. The look on their faces when they arrived that day, it's legendary among our staff. The business world had mythologized our story, though few knew all the details. They talked about the Innovatech miracle, how we'd risen from a promising startup to an industry leader in record time. The press called it a combination of innovation and perfect timing. Only a small circle knew the full truth, how betrayal had become the catalyst for transformation. My grandfather's wisdom about money-changing people had proven true in unexpected ways. Money doesn't just change the people who have it, he'd told me. It changes the people who want it badly enough to betray their principles. Sarah and Richard had proved him right in the most spectacular way possible. The morning brought an unexpected letter from Sarah's prison counselor. "She's been asking to make amends," the counselor wrote. She spends a lot of time talking about how she had everything and threw it away for a fantasy. Would you be willing to hear her out? I filed the letter away unanswered. Some bridges once burned should stay ashes. The corporate landscape had changed dramatically in the year since their betrayal. Maxwell Investments' collapse had created opportunities throughout the industry, and we'd seized every one. The Asian market expansion that Richard had dismissed as overambitious was now the cornerstone of our global operations. James brought in the latest acquisition proposals. 3 more financial tech firms want to merge with us, he reported. They've seen how we handled the Maxwell acquisition. Everyone wants to be part of the success story. Success had many authors. Rebecca's legal strategy had turned their betrayal into a textbook case of justice served. Tom's security protocols had transformed corporate espionage prevention. Linda's insights had helped us understand and prevent similar frauds. Even Catherine's support had helped us maintain stability during the transition. The afternoon brought news from the federal prosecutor's office. Richard had tried to appeal his sentence, claiming he'd been unfairly portrayed as the mastermind. The appeal had been denied. The evidence speaks for itself, the judge had written. This was a calculated betrayal on every level. Standing in my office that evening, looking at the city lights below, I reflected on the year's transformation. The quiet one, the detail-oriented one, the one they'd underestimated. I had turned their betrayal into the foundation of something extraordinary. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Somehow, Sarah had gained access to a phone in prison. I understand now, she wrote, what real success looks like, what real power is. I'm sorry I learned too late. I deleted the message without responding. Her lessons were her own to learn now. The next morning brought the annual industry rankings. Innovatech Solutions hadn't just survived Sarah and Richard's betrayal. We'd become the standard by which others were measured. Our security protocols, developed in response to their actions, had become industry requirements. Our financial models, built with the inheritance they hadn't known about, had revolutionized the sector. You know what the best revenge really is? Linda asked during our celebration dinner. It's not just succeeding. It's succeeding so completely that your betrayers become footnotes in your success story. She was right. Sarah and Richard had tried to write a story of triumphant betrayal. Instead, they'd become cautionary tales in a much larger narrative, one about resilience, strategic thinking, and the power of playing the long game. The Greece photo and Sarah's cruel text message were now archived in our company's museum, along with the newspaper headlines chronicling our rise. They served as reminders not of pain, but of transformation, how betrayal had become the foundation of empire. My grandfather's portrait hung in my office now, his wise eyes seeming to approve of how his inheritance had been used, not just to survive betrayal, but to transform it into unprecedented success. He'd taught me that money changes people, but he'd also taught me how to use that knowledge wisely. The story had come full circle. Sarah and Richard's attempt to destroy me had given me everything I needed to build something far greater than they could have imagined. Their betrayal had been meant to be an ending. Instead, it had become the beginning of a much greater story. And as I looked out over the city that night, at the empire built from their betrayal, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. They'd thought they were writing my final chapter. Instead, they'd only written their own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.